We have been working on this for some time. So Huawei is a big telecom company. They've been in the market for a long time, and they're just now getting into the enterprise market. And this show is really Huawei Enterprise's coming out party. So really delighted to have them with us, and also delighted to have John Roese. He's the Senior Vice President and General Manager for Huawei Enterprise. He's also sort of an Interop veteran, probably very well known to many of you. He was at Interosys and Nortel and some other technology companies. He's a fabulous speaker, and I think the combination of Huawei Enterprise and John Roese is a really strong one. So please welcome John Roese, Senior Vice President and General Manager for Huawei Enterprise.
Good morning. Everybody awake? All right. So I'm glad to be back at Interop. As mentioned, my name is John Roese. I'm the Senior Vice President, General Manager at Huawei Enterprise. As mentioned, I've been in the industry a little while. I was formerly the global CTO at Nortel, the CTO at Broadcom, CTO at Interosys, CTO at Cabletron. Some of those names probably don't exist anymore. Some of you look old enough to remember some of them. It's been an interesting industry for the last 20 years. So this morning, I'm really looking forward to doing a few things with you. The first is to introduce Huawei as an enterprise player, because I'm going to guess that a lot of you don't either know Huawei or know much about us. So as a show of hands, who considers themselves highly educated on Huawei as a company? Okay, good. Not many. Good. So we have something to do. Secondly, I think it's a great opportunity, not to do a company pitch or a product pitch, but to talk about the industry. I think this is a fantastic industry that goes through lots of inflections, and so we're going to try to touch on our point of view around where the industry's been, where it is, and most importantly, where it's going. And we're pretty excited about where it's going. That's why we're entering this industry in force right now. And then lastly, in the spirit of an Interop keynote, we have to give you some advice about how to navigate that future, because part of our responsibility as participants in this industry is to help each other be successful in the future. So to start, let's start with something very simple. Actually, if we could go back one slide, please. Okay. So the first thing my first very simple objective, and we'll be a quiz at the end, is the pronunciation of Huawei. The thing on your lanyards is Huawei, not Hawaii, not some other term. It's a company name. It comes out of China, fairly easy to pronounce. But who are we? So when a little bit of demographic on the company is about a $30 billion telecommunication technology solution provider. Started about 20 years ago, highly globalized. Only about 30% of our revenue is in China. The rest is around the world. We have a very large carrier business. I think we're number 5 in the world in terminals, which is smartphones, tablets, and embedded data cards. I think we're number 1 in that sector. And now we're beginning to formally enter the enterprise market because we believe that it's a very exciting, adjacent, and important space. We have about 110,000 people around the world, and about half of the population of the company is engineers. So it's a very technically oriented company. From an enterprise perspective, while the bulk of our revenue is in the carrier world, this year marks the first time that we have formally defined and executed an enterprise business. Up until now, enterprise has been somewhat opportunistic. You have a carrier that wants to do some enterprise stuff. You have an enterprise that looks like a carrier. We sell them some adjacent technology. And over the last 2 years, that opportunistic enterprise sales has grown from nothing to $1 billion to $2 billion last year. And this year, we estimate $4 billion in enterprise revenue, true enterprise revenue. And next year, our projection is it will be $7 billion, which will clearly place us as the second largest enterprise technology company in the infrastructure side. That's all very exciting, but we needed to formalize the business. So Interop is our North American introduction. We are now here. We are excited to be here. You'll hear more about that later. So enough about us. Let's talk about the industry. So bit of a nostalgic view in the past. Who in this room has been in the industry for more than 10 years? Raise your hand. 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years. Okay, that's it. So the bottom line is, if your hand was up beyond about 10 years, you remember something very exciting. You remember that the enterprise environment was the most exciting place for technology. You remember you introduced a technology in your enterprise, and you brought it home, and people said, wow. I'm holding in my hand something called a RIM 900. If anybody had one of those, it was really exciting at the time. It was a device that was mobile that could allow you to do email anywhere. This device came out when most of the consumer world was still dial-up sound followed by "you've got mail." So a huge and exciting, interesting place. In fact, we were, how shall I say, the sexy place when it came to technology. The consumer world was nowhere near where the enterprise could accomplish in terms of technology. The unfortunate thing, though, is around 2000, 2001, something terrible happened. And it wasn't just one something. It was a lot of somethings. We had a dot-com bubble burst, and that wiped out a whole bunch of very innovative technology companies. We also had interesting things like regulation materialize. I have CIO friends that tell me that in their IT budget, 50% of their budget is spent supporting what they have, 49% is spent supporting the regulatory and compliance obligations they have, and 1% is left over for them to do the one really interesting technology project that they can afford that year. That's not a great environment to do innovation, to be perfectly honest. More importantly, we also suffered through Code Red, NIMDA. I remember walking into an enterprise environment one day and there were paper signs on the doors in this large data center of a very large, well-known enterprise company saying, "Don't log into the network, there's something bad happening." That was the day Code Red hit. Many of you probably lived through that. The problem is that not only did all of that occur that made our life complex and difficult, but something else happened in the industry in terms of the dynamics and the structure of it. We saw an industry that back in 1999, 2000 was probably 20 or 30 billion dollars of addressable market for infrastructure that was growing. And every year, with a few recessions in the middle there, grew pretty significantly. And today it's a 50, 60, 70, $100 billion business. But the bad thing that occurred is during that time frame, the last decade, a whole bunch of companies just disappeared. They got consolidated into larger companies or they vanished. And where we sit today is an industry that is actually significantly larger than it's been ever, but has far fewer competitors than it has had in a decade. In fact, when we actually started thinking about entering the enterprise market, we tried to find out who entered the enterprise market recently as a big player, and we had to look a decade into the past to companies like VMware to find companies that really got serious about this space. That does not breed innovation. Big market, few competitors, lots of complexity, makes it really difficult to do things that are exciting. Our world gets worse, however, because not only did all that happen, but because of it, our reputation changed. We were no longer the interesting, innovative, sexy technology place, but we became the Department of No. And I can say this because I was a CIO and I ran a Fortune 500 IT organization, and I learned that we went from being technology enablers to the police force. And, no offense to police, they're great people, but they're not necessarily the people you want to run into if you're kind of stretching the envelope a bit, which most of our employees do. More importantly, that Department of No mentality was really focused on the fact that we couldn't embrace new technology because it was too risky. It was too complex. We didn't have the resources. We didn't have the budget. And so during a period of time where social networking materialized and mobility materialized and consumerization happened, we were the people that were saying, no, you can't bring that Mac into the environment. We're not sure how to handle a tablet. We're concerned about broadband mobility. We really don't want you to do that social networking stuff. And we had perfectly legitimate reasons to say no, but our employees didn't care. And the reason they didn't care is because in parallel to this enterprise world, there was something else happening. And that something else was happening on the consumer side of the house. The consumer side, back 10 years ago, wasn't very exciting. There were a few interesting companies, but really the activity was quite minor compared to enterprise IT. But over the last decade, we saw companies like Google and Amazon and Apple and Facebook and an endless stream of new entrants come into the market, and with them came entirely new concepts and technology and excitement. And the result is, if you actually plot them over time, you saw a growing market, similar to the enterprise, but you also saw a massive expansion in the number of competitors and a high degree of innovation in this environment. Now, you may ask yourself, well, what does that matter? We're enterprise people. Who cares what's going on the consumer side? Except it does matter. And it matters because our people, including ourselves, are absolutely in both of these markets. When you leave your office, or maybe when you're in your office, you are touching the consumer world, and you are touching the enterprise world. Our customers touch both, our employees touch both, we touch both. And unfortunately, with that interaction between these two domains, if one is breeding incredible excitement and innovation and has a huge attractiveness, a large degree of magnetism, and the other one, okay, we'll do that. And the other one, karaoke time, and the other one is fundamentally having to basically play risk management, which is important but not as exciting, and you're a person straddling those two domains. It is inevitable that some of the technology from the exciting consumerized world will leak into that enterprise. We call that the consumerization of IT. It's a very popular term right now. More importantly, as the consumerization of IT occurs, and you have this environment where technology like social networking and broadband mobility and home technologies are starting to become prevalent in the enterprise, with or without your permission, your employees are beginning to expect that the enterprise experience should be equivalent in terms of excitement, opportunity, and functionality to what they see in this other domain. Your typical employee does not understand there is a difference between enterprise and consumer. They understand that technology is technology and we should use it to solve business problems, and where it comes from is irrelevant. We as IT people understand that's not quite exactly how it works right now, because the industry composition is highly segmented as enterprise, carrier, and consumer, by vendor, by technology, by ecosystem. So, where does this leave us? We can't stop consumerization of IT. It's already bled into our environment. It's making our life complex. And at this point, I could just end the presentation, and we could take this all home to our children and convince them to become doctors and lawyers and not IT professionals. And it might be good advice if we didn't think something exciting could happen in the future. Now, I'm an optimist, and I believe that, interestingly enough, we are at a moment in time where the enterprise has a huge opportunity to do some very interesting things, but only if we begin to think differently about what tools and technologies and approaches we use. You heard Werner this morning talk about some things at Amazon. You've heard things about cloud. These are all early indicators of what might be possible as our toolkit for the future. So my feeling is there are really two things in play that are going to make enterprise exciting for at least the next 5 or 10 years. Number one is that there are companies like Huawei that are actually entering this space now. We are getting excited about it. Big players, we're an unknown, if you will, but a $4 billion to $7 billion unknown company that is entering the space aggressively because we're excited about its possibility for a future. But the more important thing is that there is a macro change in the entire industry, not just carrier. Could you go back one? Previous slide, thanks. But not just happening in the enterprise side or the carrier side or the consumer side, but there is an overall trend called ICT that is occurring, in which we are realizing that the best and most interesting technologies are not coming from any one particular ecosystem. Let me give you a real tangible example that I bet most of you are using. How many of you are using an iPhone, an iPad, or an Android device? Probably everybody. Are you using it on a mobile broadband network? Cellular. Are you running business applications on it like email? Of course you are. Which vendor provided that to you? The whole thing. Nobody. There isn't a vendor who built that solution for you. You figured it out yourself. You said, I want the best consumer product because the interface is kind of cool. It works well for me. I want it on a network that gives me accessibility wherever I'm at. And I want to do work and do entertainment on this device. And you figured it out, and you built it, and you assembled it. And that is a classic example of an ICT solution. You can't build that with just enterprise technology or just carrier technology or just consumer technology. You can try, but it won't be as effective as what you have right now. We believe that the future of the enterprise is going to be focused on ICT-oriented solutions, big problems that can only be solved by tapping into a broader ecosystem. Those problems carry adjective names associated with them. They are building the federated enterprise. How do we collaborate across enterprises on a global scale? How do we extend the enterprise for the experience to be in the home or when we're mobile? How do we virtualize the enterprise so that we have functionality that's sometimes internal and external, a la cloud, that gives us much more efficiency? How do we mobilize the enterprise so that the enterprise experience is anywhere that we need it, not just anywhere that we can deploy an enterprise network? These are big concepts that we have to figure out how to solve, because if we do, we actually bring very, very specific business value, whether it's cost containment or growth opportunities to our enterprises. So let me get very specific for a second here. Let me take one particular vertical, e-education. If you want to solve the e-education problem right now, you want to have a solution that's going to solve this problem, you could do it with purely enterprise technology. A perfectly valid solution would be to upgrade your campus network, make it a highly connected campus, to add Wi-Fi to it so that you can be mobile on the campus. Most of you have hopefully already done that. You could put a mass notification system in place to send out messages, whether they're security related or informative over SMS and other things. And you could even be really aggressive and deploy telepresence systems so you connect remote classrooms together. At the end of doing that, you could officially stamp your solution, e-education, and you would be right. That would be a good solution. But would it be the best solution you could build if you actually took a broader perspective on what technology is available to you? In this case, if you take a step back and say, well, what if I think about this as an ICT problem? And I don't just look at the enterprise products, but I look into the consumer world and the carrier world and everything that's available to me. Well, let's play it again. You start with what we have, that e-education solution. But now, instead of just focusing on the campus and the enterprise technology, include in it the mobile broadband devices, the tablets, the smartphones, even the internet-connected TVs, which are accessible to you. Set-top boxes today are no more different to program or to deploy applications on than an Android devices, because many of them are Android devices. If you include these, what you've done is now brought the educational experience, or at least connectivity, to the home. You've brought it to the park. You've brought it to the bus, which makes a lot of sense when you're trying to educate people. Why should you only educate them in the classroom? Educate them everywhere. But more importantly, in order to make this work, you don't want to just connect them. You want to connect them and provide content and engage with them. So, again, trying to do that as an enterprise is quite hard. But if you look to the carrier world, there's huge advances going on in content delivery networks and media processing, which says instead of worrying about what screen they're on, take your content, digitize it, put it as video, but send it into a CDN and let the CDN deal with the screen formatting and the transcoding and the complexity of touching different devices and reaching those entities. It allows you to extend not just connectivity, but the content itself. But take it even further. Look to the carrier world out of the entertainment space in places like IPTV, where things like interactivity have started to emerge, which was originally created for things like voting on American Idol. Why not apply that to the educational solution, where in this case, as your students go home, they are interacting with their homework as opposed to just reading it. They're watching a video, but maybe on their smartphone, an interactivity experience materializes that asynchronously is asking them what they understand, whether they got it, asking them questions, quizzing them, allowing them to interact with each other in a social way, and more importantly, pulling that information back so that when the teacher walks into the classroom the next day, they know that not only did you do your homework, but they understand if you got it, what you had trouble with, what you found interesting, and the educational experience picks up an entirely different level when you start the day the next day. You could take it even further, and I think Werner talked a lot about this morning, and say, well, boy, this is really hard. We have tight budgets. But if you want to do this type of ICT solution, if you open up to the idea that much of this is not mission critical and highly secure, and there are new economic models of taking a whole bunch of this stuff and putting it into a public cloud infrastructure so that you don't have to build up your data center to do these things like host a whole bunch of content that anybody can access. You can take advantage of the flexible compute and storage architectures that are emerging and create what really is not just e-education, but an e-education everywhere experience. My point behind this is there's a huge difference when you solve this problem using classic enterprise technology and ecosystems versus when you look beyond that and think about how to solve this problem using the ICT ecosystem. It doesn't matter what vertical you're in. If there's an E in front of your next solution, the best way to solve it is probably an ICT experience. If you're on e-health, your doctors, your patients are not sitting in a hospital or a clinic all the time. They're wherever they need to be. And they want to interact in interesting ways, and they will benefit by tapping into more than just classic enterprise technology. If you're in e-retail, the same thing applies. If you're in e-manufacturing, the same thing applies. My point here is the toolkit is changing for the enterprise, and we have to look beyond our classic assumptions of toolkit that we've been using for the last 10 years to solve the problems in the correct and best way in the future. By the way, we've all seen our toolkit change before. As a bit of disclosure, 15, 20 years ago, I was a token ring S&A guy. We don't have that toolkit anymore. We changed. We got into the internet era. Well, now we're going to go into the ICT era, and we're actually going to view consumer and carrier and enterprise not as different markets, but as different tools in our arsenal to solve enterprise problems. The challenge is going to be our ecosystem is going to have to change. The way we interact with vendors, the way we operate internally, and the way we think about some very simple concepts is going to have to be updated, just like it's updated in the past at many other times. So I'll end with a little bit of discussion about some things to think about when navigating this ICT transition, which, by the way, will be a multi-year, the next decade will be the era of ICT for enterprise. The big five, as I call them. Security. There's lots of things I can give you for advice on security, but the one thing I can tell you that's probably the best way to think about security in the ICT era, the best question you can ask yourself is the question, what are you trying to protect? In an ICT experience, you have to take a step back and say, maybe there are entities in the network or in the solution that I don't care that I have to protect. Somebody else needs to protect them. But what I do need to protect are some critical functions, like maybe it's the content I'm interested in protecting, or the session, or the people. If you ask that question in an ICT context, it immediately sets your priority about where your security focus should be. When it comes to cost is an interesting one. You have to ask yourself, is it a CapEx problem, an OpEx problem? Where is the real cost in this ICT solution, or the cost savings or cost benefit? But my advice to you is not necessarily just to answer that question, but as a point of advice, realize when your toolkit gets bigger, one of the things that you get to avoid is the mass customization that you have to do when your toolkit is quite narrow. If you don't like the functionality of one SaaS solution that's going to be part of your overall ICT offering, go find another one that works better. There's plenty out there. There's huge innovation. And if you avoid customization, if you take technology as it is as much as possible, then you can participate in the economics of that ecosystem without being slowed down, without being stuck in the past. Fewer vendor offerings mean more customization because every enterprise is different. More offerings means that the product comes to you more suitable on day one, which limits your exposure to that customization and the legacy connection that you have to maintain. Regulation. We're all in regulated environments in one way or another. The thing to remember about regulation, and I've been dealing with this since HIPAA in 1996, is there is no regulation that specifies a technology. Regulation specifies a behavior. And so when you move to the ICT world, where you incorporate cloud and mobile broadband, you still must understand the spirit of the law, but you don't necessarily have to solve the problem the way you solved it in the past. HIPAA, for example, is very specific about you need to partition patient information in clearinghouses so the wrong people do not get access to the wrong information. There's nothing in there that says you have to use Firewall A or this IDS system. It has a very clear mandate about what you must accomplish. And when you move to a cloud environment, if the cloud environment can provide you with that functionality and security posture, then it can be HIPAA compatible. It's just a new way to think about security by understanding the spirit of the law, not just the technology you used in the past in another solution to solve the problem. Availability. Availability is interesting because obviously we run businesses and we don't want them to fail. But there's an interesting thing that happens when you have more diversity in your systems. The most interesting thing is, simply put, which is higher availability? A 5 nines or 6 nines system, singular system, or having 3 or 4 ways to accomplish the same task on diverse networks using diverse technology. Clearly, the second one is probably more survivable. In the case of the educational experience, if you are giving the educational experience over smartphones and tablets and connected TVs and classrooms and telepresence, if one of them fails, who cares? Move to the next one. The students probably have multiple ways to access that information. And the availability of any one of them can be actually significantly lower, but the system level virtual availability can be much higher. And lastly, with risk. We are all in the risk management business. But here's a good news point, to end on a high note, I guess. We as IT professionals have gotten very good at implementing new technology. We don't do as much of it these days because we're not being supplied with as much new technology as we used to, but our process is correct. When you introduce new technology, whether it's a new switch or router, or a new voice over IP solution, or a massive IT undertaking like we've talked about today, the methodology is the same. It's classic enterprise risk management. Plan it, test it, monitor its behavior, and be comfortable adapting for the new problems that you discover We've been doing that forever. We know how to do it very well. It's just that the tools that we use are going to be different in this new era. By the way, it's not just us saying this. Our friends at Gartner have some very interesting reports out there that talk about this idea that if you can bring diversity into your vendor base, diversity into your technology base, it actually has an effect of reducing complexity in many cases. It creates some honesty in the solution. As we move into the ICT experience, the same principle applies, except now we can tap into a much broader spectrum of technology to use to solve enterprise problems. So as now at Huawei, I'm extremely excited to be here. I'm excited to be back in the enterprise after spending a few years on the carrier side. I think it's an exciting time for all of us because if we think about the problems we haven't solved, e-education the right way, e-commerce, e-health, many of you are probably doing projects in these spaces and are seeing the excitement when you actually address an enterprise problem with the same flexibility and user-centric design that the consumer world has been using for years now. And it's an exciting time to enter this market as a big player, but it's also an exciting time to be a customer in this market because suddenly we're getting a whole new set of toys to play with to build our solutions. We're being able to tap into bigger ecosystems, and it's going to be a very exciting journey. So Huawei is thrilled to be in this market now. Please come visit us. Please interact with us. We would love to know what problems you're trying to solve. We're very excited about solving those problems together. And lastly, I'll just end with, one very simple request. Now that you know how to pronounce the name Huawei, share that with your friends and family. Tweet it, because it's really nice to have people recognize the name and not mispronounce it, having been at some companies that had mispronounceable names in the past. So thank you for your time today. It's an exciting time to be in the enterprise, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thanks, John.